Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today on McGill24 for this special event on creativity and writing. I would like to warmly welcome Kasia Van Schaik, who's the author of We Have Never Lived on Earth, a linked story collection forthcoming with the University of Alberta Press this year, and See Burial Laws According to Country, a poetry chapbook. Her writing has appeared in Electric Literature, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Best Canadian Poetry Anthology, the Rumpus, and the CBC, and has been awarded the Mona Adelman Prize for Poetry related to ecological concerns, the Peterson Memorial Fiction Prize, and the Quebec Federation Short Story Prize. In 2021, Kasia was named a CBC QWF Writer in Residence. A PhD candidate and a creative writing instructor at McGill University, Kasia lives in Montreal. Kasia, over to you, and everyone please enjoy the event.
Thank you so much, Victoria. It's wonderful to be here. Can everybody hear me? It's all right? Okay, great. It's so wonderful to be here, and thank you everybody for joining today's event. Before I introduce our very special guest, who I'm just delighted to be speaking with today, I'm very pleased to announce that today, March 9th, is McGill24. McGill24 is our university's one-day digital fundraising campaign. Today, we invite all members of the McGill community, far and wide, to make a gift to areas and initiatives across the university that resonate most with you. Last year on McGill24, McGillians raised $3.8 million on the strength of more than 6,000 donors. It was the largest fundraiser of its kind in Canadian university history, so very exciting. Let's see if we can top that this year. All day for 24 hours, McGill24 will feature a variety of participation challenges, meaning that each dollar raised will count for more. I invite you to visit mcgill24.ca for the real-time results where the campaign stands, and of course to make your gift. You'll also be able to download McGill24 Party Pack to add some red and white flair to your social accounts or your Zoom screen. And a social media kit is available with all the instructions on how to spread the word using your Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. And finally, you're also invited to the McGill24's event page, where you can join more activities being held throughout the day. Which brings us to today's event, featuring the incredible Heather O'Neill. Heather is a novelist, short story writer, and essayist. Her work, which includes Lullabies for Little Criminals, The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, Daydreams of Angels, and has been shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction, the Orange Prize for Fiction, and the Scotiabank Giller Prize in 2 consecutive years, and has won CBC Canada Reads, the Paragraph Hugh McLennan Prize for Fiction, and the Danuta Gleed Award. Born and raised in Montreal, Heather lives there or here today with her daughter, her incredible daughter, Arizona O'Neill, who's also an artist. I'm just so pleased to be speaking with you today, Heather. And I wanted to start off with asking a little bit about your writing process, and I'm sure so many people here today are interested to know where that magic and creativity comes from. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about your writing process, your sources of inspiration. Are you always working through a storyline when you're writing a novel in your daily life? Or do you need it to be in a certain environment to be focused, to be creative? And I guess I wanted to ask, what are some activities you like to engage with while writing a novel?
Okay. I'm excited to talk to you too, Kasia, and thank you everybody for coming. So what was the question? What is my creative process? Like, what do I'm so discombobulated this morning, sorry. So I write at home, and that's why I like live alone in an apartment. I can't actually write with anybody else in the apartment. I just kind of it's too distracting because I'm just in this fictional world. And there's something very awkward about people watching you writing too, because it's such a, I'm always like in some sort of physical strange position on the couch or whatever, and it looks like you're doing nothings a lot of the times because you're just staring into space, contemplating a line or whatnot. So yeah, I work at home, and then there's not a lot I do. I think I consume a lot of culture, and I always have. I've just been very curious, and one just accumulates interests in little details. And I just have certain fascinations throughout the years, and they're usually fascinations that have been with me like since I was young. A lot of them actually I started really being interested in when I was at McGill too. Like around that time, it's like your mind is so curious and receptive, and you're building your own personality, and then when you're a writer, your personality somehow becomes your persona. And so you're just building what your interests are. And so many of the things that I became interested in, then they evolved into like novel ideas so much later on. So
Oh, that's
I'm just researching all the time. I don't actually like I spend the majority of my time just kind of writing and reading, which was, I think like if you're a big reader as a child, one of your objectives in life is like, how do I find the situation for myself where I could just read all the time and everyone will leave me alone with books. So it's very kind of solitary, introspective process, I would say.
I think I read in an interview somewhere that you wake up in the morning and the first thing you do is read or kind of consume. I'm not sure if that's still something you do, but
yeah, I read in the morning. Like I never write in the morning. At first, waking up is I don't understand how people are creative in that point, because I'm so miserable every time I wake up, like every morning. And then I'm like, even this morning, I was like, it's impossible. I will never get out of bed. It's just, I give up on reality. I don't know why that process from the dream world to waking is so excruciating. So I usually then will read for a few hours in the morning, and it really just stimulates my ideas and gets my brain into like this big brain mode where just anything's possible. And it's nice to be in someone else's brain right at the beginning, because it just it makes, when I go back to my own brain, sort of like with crops, when you like, not that I know anything about farming, I know they alternate their crops. So it's like different ideas in my brain. And then usually in the late afternoon, I'll start writing, and then I write into the evening and night.
Wow, I love this metaphor of this kind of cross-fertilization, the crops. That's beautiful. That's really wonderful. I wanted to actually ask you a little bit about research and kind of the sense of permission to be an artist. So I'm currently working on a book of cultural criticism at the moment, based on the question of what are the conditions for female genius and what needs to change in order to make more room for women's voices, for women's intellectual life in the world. And of course, that's something, reading Lullabies for Little Criminals, you see this precocious young girl who could be a genius. She's so smart, but maybe doesn't have the right circumstances there. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about what you feel are the conditions for female genius. What are some of the experiences that have given you a sense of artistic permission? And maybe speak a little bit about your journey as a writer, your models and mentors. Because I just another note on this sense of artistic permission. I know that for myself, I haven't really been able to use the word research to describe what I do until really recently. I felt like, oh no, that's a precious word. That word doesn't belong to me. That word belongs to serious older scholars that word is not mine to use. So I wondered a little bit about how you came into finding that sense of empowerment.
Yeah, it's funny how you say permission, because it is, I think as a woman, when to become a writer, one has to, you're openly acknowledging that you think your thoughts are so interesting that putting them on the page and sharing them with the world is what you should focus your life on doing. And there's so much in life, going through, I found I was always ridiculed for that, just even when you're young, and even admitting it when you're, at the time when I was a young woman, that I had so much ambition and that I wanted to become a writer and write these novels that people would read. And I mean, I came to that idea quite early on, and I was always regarded as selfish. Every time I was writing, I was selfish. And then even physically, every time I dated someone, they were always destroying my notebooks. It became this recurring thing in every relationship where they knew that the notebook was somehow the priority. And everybody, because they're you're a woman, you're supposed to be a caregiver, you're supposed to do this, and it's supposed to matter to you. And it just didn't matter to me. I'm I take care of myself. Everybody else should take care of themselves too. So everyone was always stealing my notebooks and throwing them out the window and putting them in the garbage can. And so it was always but normally people give in before that, when there's demands on your time. And then, because a time for a writer is the greatest capital you can have. So as women, there are always people making demands on your time and saying that you're selfish if you don't, and not in the same way they wouldn't do it for a man, because a man is supposed to focus and have this career and stuff. So I think your tendency is to give in and then put the writing off till later. But I just absolutely refused to do that, to the point where I was physically fighting for notebooks, and then just ruining, and it ruins relationships and whatever. But I just don't care. I just knew that I would not be happy if I didn't pursue this goal that I had, and that I had this path to follow in life. And I had had such a miserable, abusive childhood that it felt like I deserve to do something for myself. And also, and it was the one profession too, where having an abusive childhood was actually gave you fodder and material and perspective on the world. So, and I had read so many, I was so obsessed with biographies of writers, because I didn't exactly know how one became a writer. So I'd always read their biographies and memoirs, which were completely useless, because everything's specific to a time. I remember I was a teenager and I took out Maxim Gorky's book, My Education, because I was I'll see how he became educated as a writer. And it's crazy, Russian revolutionary stuff, and riffraff in Moscow. And I was and the underbelly of Moscow's underworld. And I was okay, it's not quite connecting to me. But what I do get is that there's something marvelous about any writer's story, and what is oppressive becomes you can turn it into something else, and you can turn it into gold and metaphor. And so I was just if I don't pursue my path of writing, all I am is this miserable little riffraff from a bad neighborhood who was abused as a child. So it became really important to me that I was going to redefine myself as a writer. So I think as a woman, it was just everywhere, every kind of social situation I was in, it was just what are you doing? It's so ridiculous that you just scribble in your notebooks all the time. To what end? Really, do you think you're going to come up with something great? And I'm no, maybe not. But I am going to attach the utmost importance to this writing.
I mean, I'm totally shocked by the fact that these people were throwing away your notebooks. It makes me think of Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, right? Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath never published her last novel because it disappeared, right? So yeah, I'm so glad that you were able to kind of persevere even with that kind of treatment. Yeah, that's really extraordinary. I was wondering, so it's interesting to think about role models and then Gorky or other writers who are just so far away from your own circumstances. Were there any role models? Because I know this is actually a question I think about a lot, just the lack of role models, mentors for women writers. I know as someone who studied creative writing and had a really hard time finding mentors I wanted to work with. And I wondered if you were able to find any mentors that worked for you or any role models that helped you with your path.
Yeah, totally. It is. I did find that I was always when I was a younger writer, I was always amazed that all the male writers I knew had these older male role models who helped them out in so many ways. And then it was you couldn't really have that relationship as a young woman with a male role model, because then it just became sexual, because they're unable to see, like, maybe I would just like the career opportunities that like you're giving to the young men. I don't want to date you. You're like 50. I mean, now I don't mind 50-year-old men, but then now like, oh yeah, silver foxes. But back then I was like, why? I like guys on skateboards. But so that was really, and I was so jealous of the young male writers who had all these mentors who would do things for them. And then in retrospect, I'm like, well, why weren't women there, like women professors or writers who were reaching out to me in the same way? So I think we just don't have that culture. And like men have these, I remember reading like Roxane Gay's book, and she's like, why don't we have old women's club? Like men do it. Men get together and form these groups and societies that kind of help each other out through school. And then women aren't sort of taught to do that. And so that's like one of my something I was always unhappy with. I was like, why can't anybody help me? Guy writers seem to have somebody helping them. But, one carries on and one does what one does. And I found one of the things that really helped me out was, so I graduated in McGill around 1994. And then I sort of, like the year after, started doing a lot of open mics and spoken word. And there was a lot of like interesting Montreal writers who were kind of, really young and putting stuff out there, like Kate Colo and like Tweeta Tanya Evanson. Like there was just a lot of interesting people in that group where we would just kind of collectively get together and share each other's work or tear it apart, and just being like brutally honest. And I really learned to have a voice through that group. So it was finding a group of peers is like so important, and like kind of going back and forth, and you can kind of and we're all unpublished, so it was fun to compete with each other, as opposed to like looking at authors who had 6 or 7 books. We were like, who's going to get into this magazine? And we try really hard. And so that was actually where, in that sort of mixed up little Montreal world, that on Saint Laurent Street, that I started really, the equivalent of workshopping stuff. And that's even like, I remember I wrote this little story and I read it at a bar on Saint Laurent, which was spoken word night. And that actually, it got such good reception that night that I decided to focus on that. And that became Lullabies for Little Criminals.
Wow, amazing.
And also I think the humor in my work too is because when you're writing like speaking out loud, like you always use humor. It's such a great way, even for you to connect with the audience, because then you hear them laughing and it gives you that little like ego surge. So so much of my humor I developed then, and just realizing like what makes people laugh and what is the absurdity in what I'm saying, because I really wanted to create this world that respected its darkness and the struggles, but I also wanted it to be really funny and joyous at the same time. So kind of creating with an audience in that way. And then, you know, I had this really interesting mentor. It was Paul Tuff, who, because I was writing for him, he worked at Saturday Night, which was a magazine in in Toronto. And then he started this website, and I was just writing for him, and he was editing my work, and he was in New York. So then he actually helped me out later on by passing my work to an agent down there. So that was like a great moment for me. It's all these little moments, like, and then you get these connections, and they half the time they don't pay off. And it's so disappointing when you're young, especially because you bragged to all your friends, and then it always goes, and then it's just, you know, a lot of trial and error and doing everything. Like I had this agent once, and she gave me this advice, and she was like, nothing matters, but everything does. And I've really, you know, held on to that, because then you think, well, I'm publishing in this small magazine, like it's not going to do anything for me, but it does. Like every little thing does something, and it just this cumulative effect of getting your stuff out. So it's like that thing in acting where there's no small parts. Like every time you can get something in like a literary magazine or a website, it's just so good for you, and just like builds this kind of, it's like paying your dues, you know. That's what I tell everyone. You just like go ahead, just pay your dues, and you'll like, it's amazing what happens once you've paid your dues.
That's totally fascinating. It's so wonderful to hear about that community. I didn't know about that formed here. And all those writers you mentioned are, you know, are all published now and winning great prizes and doing so well. So it's just so great to hear that there was a space of germination and a safe space too that you could all belong to. Wonderful. Well, I actually, something you just said about reading your work at an open mic, and I think about Lullabies for Little Criminals, and just it's laugh out loud funny, but the humor actually makes it even more tragic. Like it's just punches, you're laughing and being punched in the gut at the same time. It's really incredible. And this leads to my next question, actually, about how you enter into your work. So with Lullabies or with your other novels or short stories, is it through character, concept, setting, plot, and voice? And I also wonder, just because I think some of my creative writing students might be in the audience today, and we're talking a lot about, you know, how to enter into a short story or enter into fiction. Are there any favorite writing exercises or routines that you might have to get those synapses firing?
Yeah, like I think of it as, you're right, when you know, when you see a great painting at a museum show, and then they show you on the side like all the little sketches that the artist did and worked on, and you know, worked on the rabbit and different things, and then you see the giant thing and this little tiny rabbit. So I think of it like that. I usually, well, first let's go to the top secret. How do I enter it? I usually it's different for different ones, but I usually start with character, but within the character, of course, like the context naturally comes out. So like for the last novel, the first inkling of an idea I had, it just came from this vision. Like I had been thinking of mixing two different time periods in a book, and I wasn't sure how I was going to go about. So I was just playing with different time periods, like what it would be like if I was telling the story of like the Black Plague, but during some modernist era, just everything. And then I had this idea of, so I was playing with that concept. And then I wrote the scene of these girls who were in Victorian times, but were at a costume ball dressed as figures from the French Revolution. And they were actually acting like the characters from the revolution, like Robespierre, Marquis de Sade. And so I started working, and I liked that there was something about it on the page that worked, because some ideas, you have them in your head and they seem so amazing, but then they just don't kind of work on the page. And then other things you put on the page and they just start having this magical little vibrancy, and it works, and you read it back and you're like, oh my God, okay, I've somehow replicated what's in my brain. So I worked on the characters for each one. And then as I'm building the characters, naturally you start with like throwing in little dialogue. So what I do is I have a notebook, and I do just like automatic writing with like each character and whatever comes out, and I don't even edit. And it's just everything that comes to my brain, like something they would eat, little funny things they would say, something of them falling down the stairs, who they would like, what music they would like. And it's just very like fun. And I just, I'll just do that for each one. And then I just have all these notebooks, and then I kind of type them out and then go find the excellent parts of that and kind of piece it together. So it comes from a very like, I just vomit the idea on the page so that I have all this, and once you have, because there's so much, once it's on the page, it just seems you can work with it. When it's in your head, you can't work with it yet. So I'm just like, I'll get out everything that's already could possibly be in my brain just automatically. And then I go to, research or thinking or, figuring out the characters or who's not working or who needs to be developed more. So I guess I would say I start with those character sketches, and they're fun. You get to like know the characters in different ways. And like even with this book, like the main characters are Sadie and Marie, but I had no idea they were going to be the principal characters or that their relationship would be so strong, but I had created them. And every time I had a scene with them together, they were just in love. They just kind of they were obsessed with each other and didn't care about any of the other characters. And I was like, what are you guys doing? Like, separate. We're supposed to be having a novel here. And they were like, we don't like anybody else except for each other. So I was like, okay, well, these two narcissists have dominated these notebooks. So they're going to become the center of the book.
Well, I really love that. Just imagining these sort of shadow lives taking place in the notebook. And that also just makes me think that one shouldn't be precious, about holding the ideas in your mind until you have the perfect sentence that you just, I love this, vomiting it out, the vomitarium.
Yeah, totally. And then just like excess of stuff. And then somehow, like I said, once you have it it's just much easier to work with. I mean, that's my process. Somebody else, maybe it's an incredible waste of time, but that's just the way I do it. Like some writers will sit down and write it from beginning to end, but I don't do that. Sounds like
similar to Hemingway's process of the iceberg. Like there's everything below the water, and then you just, in the end, it's the tip of the iceberg that makes it into the novel. So
yeah, it's quite remarkable how much gets thrown out. Or even when I'm going back, then I'm like, oh my God, I went on a tangent about rabbits for like 20 pages. So unnecessary, Heather. But let's like but here's like this nice little beautiful paragraph. So I'll take that and we'll build on. We just needed that one line, girl.
Well, it's still worth it then. If you got that line, it sounds like it's worth it. I guess I wanted to ask a little bit, just you describing your latest novel, and it made me think about your work in general, and this interest in female friendship, young women. And I was thinking, I was just during the last, we had just had spring break at McGill. So I took a little bit of time to just catch up on a bit of reading. And I was reading one of Elena Ferrante's book, and I was like, Heather is the Elena Ferrante of Montreal. It just struck me. You write about young women, female ambition, young girlhood in urban settings. And so much of what you write are center on young girls and women who are outsiders or a part of the seediest side of Montreal. So I guess this question then has sort of two prongs to it. One is, how much does your own life and experience shape the stories you write? And it just occurred to me, you know, your anecdote about the ex-boyfriends throwing out your notebooks. And then I know in Lullabies for Little Criminals, Baby's father throws out her diaries, her notebooks, which is again so shocking. And I see maybe a little parallel there. But so yeah, how much does your own life and experience shape the work you create? And then the other side of the question is, what is it about Montreal, the contemporary Montreal, or Montreal 100 years ago that inspires you to choose it as your setting?
I think, I mean, there's the obvious that I grew up here, but I think I love cities, and I loved the city growing up, and I feel, I was never really home. I was always kind of one of these kids who just like wander around and sit places and talk to adults just because it was impossible to be home a lot of the time. But I loved the city and downtown, like in St. Catherine Street. I was just so enamored with everything. And I think I just paid attention to it in a lot of ways. And I was so interested in the history of Montreal. And my father had me when he was quite older, for the times anyways. He was almost 50. So he had been born like in the 20s in Montreal. So he just had all these amazing stories about what Montreal used to be like. And he would just constantly like tell them to me at night. He would, we'd just sit there and he would tell his ridiculous and inappropriate, like violent tales to me. But I really loved them. And I love that sort of, the idea that Montreal was this magical place where things used to happen, but it had changed. And so I think I was very smitten by that level of storytelling in Montreal. And I think it's a very Montreal thing to just make up stories about the city. And it's like everybody you meet there, they have some fabulous story about who their family is, which can't possibly be true. I mean, but I think it's just part of Montreal, and that sort of, because it's a port city, so many people have come through with their stories. So there's that level of storytelling and narrative of people getting off the boat and having these wonderful kind of stories. And, and then it was, as a port city in the wars, like, Second World War, all the soldiers would dock in Montreal before leaving. So they leave these stories, and just, it was such a mecca of entertainment. I found the history of it so rich, and it was funny living within the history because it's living with this personality. So whenever I began describing Montreal, it seems almost magical realist, but it's not quite. It's just, I'm so enamored with it. I just kind of project these little childhood sensibilities that I used to have onto the buildings and places. So it's very rich for me. And it's always, you have this kind of a bit of a feeling of authority being able to write from where you're from. If I was so inventive about another city, they might be like, what are you talking about? It's ridiculous. But now it's like, well, I mean, how could anybody correct me on the history, I guess?
Yeah, you're the chronicler, if that's a word. Yeah, I think it's a word, of the city. I mean, it seems even thinking of some of Len Cohen's songs, and then your own writing, you're kind of giving voice or kind of translating the city, that magical realist that magic, really, not even magical real, it's just that magic that so many people experience, I think, when coming to Montreal. It just feels so vibrant in your work, which maybe leads then me to a final question before we're going to open it up to audience questions. I want to make sure we have time to hear from these lovely listeners. Let's see. Since we're thinking about Montreal, and of course we live in this, it's a very unique city within a unique province, within a unique country. Can you expand a little bit on what it's like to be an English writer in Quebec, and the particular challenges or joys that come with it, from creating and writing to publishing and promoting your work within this very specific intersectional place? And then maybe also, just as a kind of omnibus question, to add to that, I know that a lot of your work has been translated by another McGill graduate, Dominique Fortier, and I wondered if you could maybe speak a little bit about your relationship with her, your translator, and what that part of the writing process looks like for you. And then we'll turn it over to some audience questions.
Okay, so writing in Montreal, as an Anglophone, I mean, I think things are a bit different now. Like, you can kind of live anywhere these days with the internet has kind of made us all so close. But I'm going to say the advantage of living in Montreal, as I was saying before, it is because it is this romantic city, and it also was so, the cost of living was so dirt cheap, like inexplicably for a couple of decades. And so that kind of it's great for a novelist, because you can just sort of live, or you could live with very little money and just focus on these novels. So it was like a wonderful place to be a novelist. So you kind of felt, that, when all the writers in the 20th century went over to Paris because it was so cheap. And, and it definitely had that feeling. But however, as a freelancer, if you're doing stuff like that, I often think there's a lot more opportunities, say if you're an Anglophone, say in Toronto, just because you're so close to the magazines, and like, I don't know, like if you want to branch out and do television, like there's always extra work.
And you go to the parties and you meet the people and things like that.
And then when there's job offers, like, there's a list of job offers, whereas Montreal, it'll be like something tiny at a tiny, publishing house that they're maybe going to pay you. Like, it just seems somehow like you're not going to get paid. But then like in Toronto, you'll have like a whole list of jobs that are, for big publishing houses, if you want to be an editor or something, or work in that field, that you can kind of climb up. So it's always like, but you can't live two lives. So who knows if I had left, if that would have been more interesting to me, or maybe I just wouldn't have had the same sort of focus on novels and the kind of obsession of like exhuming Montreal, because I'm like somehow stuck on this magical like island. So I don't know, it has its kind of pros and cons. Everybody has like a different career and you have to work it out, but it's definitely sort of strange being an Anglophone writer in Montreal. However, then we'll go on to the second part of your question, like when my French translations, which I do with Dominique Fortier, whose writing I really love. So it was this kind of, she called me up one day and she was like, let's do this together. And I'm such a fan of her writing. So it was really, it just, like with any collaboration, you always want it to be like exciting, because then if it flops, you're like, well, at least it had this amazing potential, as opposed to something where you're like, this is like shitty potential, but maybe it'll become something. Because I'm fluent in French, and then so in the working in the French scene is so fascinating too, and the writing that's coming out from Quebec Francophone writers is so different than the rest of Canada. And also I went to my younger grade, like before university, I was educated in French. And then there was this focus on, that kind of Quebec nationalism, which led to us reading all these works of Quebec literature in class, which when I speak to other Canadians, they just didn't have that sort of curriculum. Like we were like Annibal, Marie-Claude Blaise, like Gabriel Roy, Thériault, like all of them. We just read all the Quebec classics all the time. And it just had such a huge impact on my writing, and to give it this kind of, it's very, I don't want to, like, I'm going to be totally reductive, but like a lot of the books from English Canada are kind of based on that British tradition where they have that Victorian structure of a novel, whereas a lot of the writing coming out of French Canada is more of that French philosophical school, where you have these sort of like petite novels based on crazy ideas and experimentation. And so much of that has actually infiltrated my work and my themes, and the sort of tortured child, like the abandoned little orphan, who's the psychotic young girl. That was like a lot of books that I had read in French had these very like aggressive little girls who just wanted to be seen and heard, and they were in these very peculiar environments. So that was a huge impact on my writing. So yeah, it's kind of, I think, to kind of be happy living in Quebec as a writer, it really, because I know a lot of times Anglophone writers will feel isolated, but it really, like, once you kind of get involved in the Francophone scene and explore their writing, and then you have this whole other level of wonderfulness. So yes, and since I've been like having the books translated by Dominique Fortier, then it's like they have this whole other life and just different questions and perceptions. So that's another total bonus for me, which I probably would have had if I moved to Toronto.
Right. Oh, that's wonderful. As you were speaking, I was thinking of like Marguerite Duras, her young female protagonist, and yeah, how bold and incredible. Wonderful. Well, I'm gonna there's a question from the audience, so I'll articulate that and kind of combine that question with one that I'm sure many are asking. So this question is, do you have any advice for people who've been trying to find a literary agent for a long time? And I think this question is symptomatic of maybe a larger question, which is what is sort of the piece of advice you would give to emerging writers?
That kind of goes hand in hand. Like what I was saying before is you really have to try and get published places and anywhere. And like, what are the, there's all up and coming. There's places in Montreal, like, what's that? Anyways, I don't want to say, but you guys know, if you like, what the hip places to be published now are anthologies, like anything, and you just have to really get your stuff somehow out there, even if it's like in social media, like just there's so many different ways, and you just have to kind of get somehow pieces that are out in the world, and through that you can get an agent. Like you can't get an agent if you've never, it happens occasionally, but just basically, you're not going to get an agent just by approaching them with a book if you've never been published before. Like what they will ask for, you have to send links, or and as soon as you have, say, in a story that gets nominated, maybe for the Journey Prize or something, like an article that gets a lot of likes or something, or you start having some following, like any of those things they look at. They're not, if they get a query from a novelist who has no sort of presence online or hasn't participated in anything, they're just not going to do it because you also don't have any reach or platform. So you just kind of have to build your own little name, and it's totally frustrating and humiliating and all the full of rejection. But it's like, because one of my big breaks too was, so I wrote out a story that sort of became Lullabies for Little Criminals, and I submitted it to this magazine, and it was published there, and then it got nominated for the Journey Prize. And then so Ellen Seligman, who was then the editor-in-chief at McClellan Stewart, she called me, and she's like, because she read the anthology, and she said, I thought this story was really good. Is there more of it? And then I was like, yes, of course, there's more.
Always say there's more.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, yes, of course, there's a novel on the way. And so she's like, well, when you're done, send it to me. And so like, that was just a huge, huge break for me. And I mean, she didn't end up publishing it anyways, but it was a huge break. And just to have someone like that I knew was going to read it at the end, who was someone of significance and influence. And yeah, and then it's like, and oftentimes, and that's how you'll get an agent. Like once, like the agents, especially the ones that can't, they have their ear to the ground, and they're also always reading anthologies and magazines. So they're paying attention to those. So you kind of have to somehow get their attention through that. And yeah, it's awful and it's grueling. It makes you cry, but it's like, there's no sort of like, because I was talking to my, my editor at HarperCollins, and I remember her once saying, like, she was like, when we get these novels from people who they're not even on Facebook, but they send a novel, like, unless it's the most incredible novel ever written. But she's like, even then, I don't know if we'd pick it up. Like, you have to sort of make your presence known, however that is.
They want to see you as part of a community.
Yeah, you have to work, you have to show that you've worked, exactly, and you know the community and you're working in it, and even like whatever it is, like, even like, I mean, that's sort of also why I was talking, when you have these like little coteries of other writers who are your age, and you know, you all hate each other. You just have so much like antipathy for one another because you know, you're just so competitive, and it's like but in Russia, they're just so wonderful. And you're like, oh, I hate these people. I want them all to die. It's like Truman Capote. He once said, it's like not enough to succeed. All your friends have to fail. It's like, they're so toxic in their little, like the emotions they create, but they're so important, those groups. And it's like when you know, and you help each other out, and like, and you're part of the same scene. So like when someone does well from the scene, it elevates everybody else and gives everybody else a sense. Like, it's just so important, the people that you work with. And it's good to think of them as like colleagues, other writers, and just, working with them. And, you know, as I was saying, like reading this stuff out loud, like, or whatever, it all like paid off in the end. Although it seems ridiculous at the time, you're like, this will never possibly have any value. I'm always going to be at rock bottom, like reading my stuff out loud in a bar. Like, wow, Maxim Gorky, like, I know you lived through the revolution. This sucks too. But it's, anyways, it's a long-winded thing of like, you kind of have to really find ways to make yourself interesting to an agent.
And it sounds like, you know, forming those groups is a healthy competition, but there's also, you know, when someone in your group does something really interesting and inventive, it's like gives you also a sense of freedom. You're like, oh, I can do that.
Oh,
Why did I try that? You know?
Totally. And again, you shape each other's tastes because you end up writing what the other ones like or respond to, and they're just sort of your first readers. And it's yeah, I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating the toxic thing, but But just to say, like, because sometimes you're like, your friends are such a, so it's so complicated, but you really have to think of them as colleagues, and they're and they're just really, it's really important to spend time with other writers who are at your level.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another question, Heather. You mentioned from the audience, you mentioned how the personality you develop through your youth studies and etc. feeds into your persona as an author. Can you talk more about this personality to persona switch or process?
Oh yeah, it's always sort of interesting, this idea, like, what is a persona, right? And it seems fake kind of when you talk about it, but there's this difference between your personality and your persona, and your persona is who does the writing, and it almost protects your personality in a way, because you just get to be you, but then you develop this writer self, and this writer self is just always on. So in the terms of like, the persona is what your themes will be, what you're going to speak to, like how you want to engage with the world. Like, do you want to be, are you interested in activism? So are you going to write this activist stuff? And then it's like your personality has to embody that. And, you know, and it always sounds kind of cheap, I guess nowadays too, people call it branding or whatever, but which kind of seems superficial. So I like to talk about persona, but it's creating this bigger self that, as Kasia was talking about, gives you permission, but it's also like an authority. And that is your writerly self, who just is like, writer Heather is just bolder and like more feminist and outrageous and angry and murderous and inscrutably wonderful. Like, I'm not like that in real life. I'm just basically like sleeping or eating or reading books. But my persona, like, it's the Heather O'Neill, or it's like I don't know why I keep coming up to Maxim Gorky, probably because there's trouble in Russia, but
yeah,
you know, so it's like the Maxim Gorky, or it's like someone like Jean Genet, who was he was always very squirmish about answering actual questions about his actual autobiography, and didn't want to give people point by point, because he lived so much from that, the idea of having been an orphan and having been in a juvenile detention facility, and then meeting other criminals and falling in love with them instead of being afraid of them and just describing them as flowers. So, you know, that's like Jean Genet created this persona in order to turn this squalid world into something of astounding beauty and just irreverence and subversiveness. So it's like, that's the Jean Genet who we meet in the books, and he gives to everybody else, like who Jean Genet is in, you know, real life. It's very similar. Like, your persona has to be similar to who you are. I mean, it doesn't, but I think for great writers, like, it does, you know, like McGill24, it's like, it's something that you just kind of find the self, like the self that you want to say something to the world, and kind of, and brings these little truths from, I mean, a lot of writers kind of talk about how so much of what a writer draws from is childhood, but I think it's like that, the sense of self you develop in childhood, and then when you become an adult, like who you think you are. And it's like when you start writing, it's like that question, you know, especially like when you're a kid, it's like, who do you think you are? It's like, this is who I think I am. Like, here's my book. As you see, it was quite interesting. So it's not, you know, but in real life, they're like, oh, stop, must you scribble all the time? And it's like, I'm creating this thing. I don't know if that answers it, but I think, because the first time too, I think I was quite young, and then I had met this older writer, and their one piece of advice was like, learn to create like you have to have a persona, and the persona writes. And then I didn't know what they were talking about, because it's a natural kind of thing that you do and you don't realize that you're doing it.
It almost sounds like a protective kind of distance to kind of keep yourself a little bit like slightly removed from the product. I don't know. It's interesting.
I don't know. It's almost like, well, then you become a writer, and it's like it's almost like you become a puppeteer to yourself and the self. So you make like yourself into a puppet, and the puppet dances. And then you spend all your time working on the scenery for the puppet, the strings for the puppet, the lines for the puppet. And then who are you? Like, you sort of don't exist in the same way. Like, you just become this vehicle for the puppet. It's really complicated. This is one of the things, like, I wish everybody was here and we could discuss it together, because it's one of those things. Yeah, it would be great. Like, it's such a perplexing question, because then it brings the idea of like, was that actually authentic? And for me, it's like, yeah, but that's more authentic. Like, it's just so interesting to do. And then as a writer too, because I write a lot of nonfiction and memoir pieces, which is also involves sort of, it's an editing of the self and how I will present myself. And it's all fascinating.
That's I should just say that when I mentioned I was going to be interviewing you, a friend of mine said, Heather O'Neill, she's like the coolest writer in Canada. I'd be super intimidated. And I was like, no, Heather's lovely. I mean, you can be cool and lovely at the same time, but you definitely come across as, the coolest ever. There are some more questions, but unfortunately we're actually at the wrap up time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to Heather. I've just enjoyed this so much. And it's just been fascinating to hear a little bit about your process and about your engagement and relationship to your work. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thanks everybody. And thank you to McGill. As an alumni, I always have a special place in my heart for McGill.
Oh, that is so wonderful. Thank you everybody for joining and supporting McGill's annual Day of Giving. And finally, McGill24 is still going strong. Right after this webinar, please visit McGill24.ca to see the campaign's real-time progress. Please consider making your own gift of any amount to any cause at McGill that holds special meaning to you. Hint, hint, literature, the arts. Help us, we need help. Thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you for these wonderful questions and for all this wonderful attention you've given to us today. Please keep in touch and continue to stay safe, everyone.
And thank you to you, Kasia, for this wonderful session. And again, thank you to Heather as well, the very cool and lovely. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your days wherever you find yourself.
Take care.